The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's ICU cast shadows like prison bars across bed 7. 3:47 in the morning. The kind of time when hospitals show their true face, when the machines do the talking and the people do the listening. Laura Bennett stood at the bedside of Marcus Chen, a 52-year-old veteran whose surgical repair had held for 6 hours before the scene decided otherwise. She noticed the change in his breathing first. Not the monitor. His breathing. The monitors were always 30 seconds behind the truth if you knew how to listen. The antiseptic smell mixed with cold coffee from the nurse's station 3 beds down. Someone had left their mug there at shift change, probably Katie from the morning team, who always forgot something, always rushed. Laura didn't forget anything. Her eyes moved across the cardiac monitor with the precision of someone who had once read the same kind of data in desert tents with nothing but a manual blood pressure cuff and the sound of her own pulse. 74 beats per minute. Then 76. Then 78. The rhythm stayed sinus, but something was wrong. Something was leaking. She pressed her hand against Marcus's chest. The heat was there. Fever didn't announce itself with warmth anymore, it announced itself with the subtle wrongness of a body fighting something it couldn't quite name. She'd felt this before. 20 years ago in a marketplace outside Kabul. Before she was a nurse. Before she'd hung up fatigues that still smelled like gun oil and diesel and things she didn't talk about. Laura moved to the medication cart without hurrying. No rushing. Rushing telegraphed panic. She drew up the labs she needed, slipped the needle into the port on Marcus's for lying with the kind of muscle memory that nursing school couldn't teach you, that only came from having done it 1,000 times under conditions that would make most people scream. His oxygen saturation was holding at 94%. For now. She swabbed the culture bottle and labeled it with handwriting that could have been printed by a machine, no tremor, no sign that her mind was already running 3 steps ahead. "How's our guy doing?" The resident, Dr. Patel, stopped at the foot of the bed on her morning rounds. 26 years old. Good hands. Terrible instincts. She relied on machines the way children relied on parents. Vital stable, Laura said. But something's off. Dr. Patel looked at the monitors. The numbers were where they were supposed to be. The green lines traced their orderly patterns across the screens. "Looks normal to me." Laura didn't argue. She'd stopped arguing 5 years ago when she realized that arguing took energy better spent on watching. Watching was her real job. Watching was what had kept soldiers alive when the radio went dead and the medevac was still 40 minutes out. She repositioned the pulse oximeter on Marcus's finger, angled his head 2 degrees to improve airway alignment, and ordered herself to wait. The body always told the truth eventually. 23 minutes later, Marcus's oxygen saturation started to fall. The monitor alarm chirped once, twice, then began its steady escalating song. 92. 88. 85. The numbers were dropping like a stone through water, and this time even Dr. Patel heard the change in the room, that subtle shift in air pressure that happened when things stopped going according to plan. Laura was already moving. She reached for the emergency cart with the same fluid precision of someone pulling a rifle from a rack, and her hands found the right equipment without conscious thought. 15-second assessment. Breath sounds on the left side, present. Right side, absent. The surgical site was swelling. The dressing was darkening at the margins. Sucking chest wound, Laura said. Seals compromised. She didn't wait for permission. She never did, which is why the other nurses called her confident and Dr. Gabriel would eventually call her reckless, though not yet. Right now he was still down in the cafeteria, still 5 minutes away from rounds, still operating in a world where Laura Bennett was just another competent RN with good instincts and nothing to explain. She reached into the crash cart supplies and her eyes found what she needed, a specimen bag from the lab, a dressing tray, and then, because the universe occasionally provided exactly what you required, an MRE pouch in Marcus's belongings near the window. Meals ready to eat. The corners creased from being carried in a rucksack for decades. She recognized the brand. She recognized the scars on the plastic. She knew those packaging materials could hold pressure better than anything specifically designed for trauma surgery because she'd learned that in a FOB outside bagram when there were no suppliers and no hospitals and nothing between a bleeding soldier and death but whatever was in the aid bag. "Get me a dressing," she said to the float nurse, whose name she'd already forgotten. Names didn't matter when the clock was running. "Take a damn if we have it. And call in surgery. Now." The nurse moved. They always did. Laura's hands were already on Marcus's chest, her fingers finding the edges of the dressing with the automatic confidence of muscle memory that had been burned in over 20 years of muscle memory that preceded this job by a decade and change. She peeled back the surgical tape, and the blood came, not spurting, which would have meant arterial and would have meant he was already dead, but steady and dark, which meant venous, which meant solvable. She positioned the MRE package against the wound site, the plastic firm and heat-sealed and actually superior to the fabric dressing that had started to fail. Her movements were smooth. Economic. No wasted motion. The tape went down, one layer across the top, one layer across the bottom, pressure distributed across a 4-inch radius to prevent tissue damage. The dressing held. O2 sat. Laura asked. 89 and rising, the float nurse answered. 90. 92. Marcus's breathing was steadying. The chest wall was moving symmetrically again. The air was getting back into the lungs because the hole in the pleural cavity had been sealed by military-grade MRE packaging and hands that had learned this skill in a country that wasn't on the news anymore, in circumstances that had never made it to any official report. She was already cleaning her hands, already pulling up the blood gas analysis on the computer, already doing the next 17 things that needed doing before the crash cart wasn't going to help anymore. The elevator doors opened down the corridor. Footsteps. Dr. Gabriel arriving for morning rounds exactly on schedule at 7 a.m., which meant he'd missed this entirely, which meant he'd never know about the improvised technique, which meant, "Get me 2 milligrams push of my Dazolam," Laura said. "And let's get a 20 gauge in his other arm. We're going to need better access for surgery." The procedure took 6 minutes total. When the crash cart team arrived, properly trained, properly credentialed, properly authorized, they found a patient stabilized, a wound temporarily sealed, and a blood gas that was improving. Marcus Chen's heart was beating. His lungs were exchanging oxygen. The crisis had passed from impossible to manageable in the time it took most people to finish a cup of coffee. Laura pulled off her gloves and dropped them into the biohazard bin with the same deliberate care she applied to everything. Her locker was in the break room on the 3rd floor. In the bottom, under the spare scrubs and the small canvas bag of personal items, sat a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. The soles were worn thin from 20 years of walking on concrete instead of sand, from a life that wore uniforms under scrubs, from muscles that remembered things her mind had learned to forget. She touched them sometimes before her shifts. Just her fingertips on the worn leather, the same way other people's hands found wedding rings or prayer beads. A ritual. A reminder. A weight she chose to carry. She'd touch them again after her shift ended. But right now, Marcus Chen needed surgery, and the crash team needed to know what she'd done, and Dr. Gabriel needed to arrive for his morning rounds and find a patient who was supposed to be deteriorating instead ascending back toward stability. She didn't know yet that he was watching. She didn't know yet that her composure under crisis, her hands that moved like they'd been trained for something far more serious than civilian nursing, her voice that could command obedience from staff who outranked her on paper, she didn't know that all of these things had already marked her as a threat in his mind. She only knew that Marcus was stable and that in Sacred Heart's ICU, where nothing surprised anyone who'd been there longer than 3 years, something had just surprised everyone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that someone had been watching. Dr. Gabriel didn't start with cruelty. He started with whispers. It began 3 days after Laura had sealed Marcus Chen's chest wound with nothing but an MRE package and muscle memory, 3 days after she'd done what no one else in that ICU could do. 3 days after he'd arrived too late to stop her. He moved through Sacred Heart like a man correcting a mistake. A quiet word to the pharmacy director about Laura's med verification shortcuts. A measured concern to the nurse manager about her resistance to proper chain of command. A suggestion to administration that former military types sometimes struggle with civilian protocols. Each conversation was carefully weighted, plausibly deniable, the kind of thing that couldn't be pinned down or reported because it was never quite an accusation. It was just observation. Concern. Prudence. The whisper network activated like a nerve firing. Other nurses began watching Laura differently. Not openly hostile, worse. Cautious. The kind of caution that made people avoid you in hallways, that made them repeat back your instructions to each other as if they needed verification. Laura moved through the hospital and felt the shift in air pressure, the way a room's temperature drops when a storm approaches. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at the Wednesday morning staff meeting. The conference room at Sacred Heart smelled like stale coffee and the particular staleness of a space where people gather to justify their existence. 23 nurses, 3 residents, 2 attending physicians, and Dr. Gabriel standing at the head of the table like a man about to distribute judgment. Laura sat in the middle row, her tablet open to her patient notes, her posture neutral. She'd learned to make herself small in rooms like this. Dr. Gabriel was talking about protocol compliance when he stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes found her across the table. "Nurse Bennett," he said, and his voice carried the texture of polished steel. "Since you seem so confident in your clinical judgment, let's test that knowledge." The temperature in the room dropped 15 degrees. A 53-year-old female with Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome presents with rapid atrial fibrillation. Heart rate 220, blood pressure dropping. "What are the contraindications for adenosine?" He was smiling. Just barely. Just enough that everyone saw it. Laura set her pen down. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Her face became a mask, the same mask she'd worn in Bagram when mortar rounds were landing close enough that you could feel the concussion in your molars. Adenosine is contraindicated in patients with pre-excitation pathways like WPW because it can cause unopposed conduction down the accessory pathway, which can degenerate into ventricular fibrillation. Correct. How would you manage her acute presentation? For calcium channel blocker or beta blocker to slow AV node conduction. Procainamide if hemodynamically stable. And if she arrests during the arrhythmia. Standard ACLS protocol. Defibrillation if indicated. Amiodarone bolus, 300 mg for. Dr. Gabriel fired 6 more questions. Medication contraindications for renal failure patients. The dosing window for TPA in acute ischemic stroke. The correct needle size for a pericardiocentesis. Dexamethasone dosing in pediatric meningitis. The pathophysiology of disseminated intravascular coagulation. Questions designed to humiliate, to expose the gaps between nursing school and emergency critical care, to prove that Laura was playing a game she had no right to be winning. She answered every single one. Precisely. Without hesitation. Without the tremor of doubt. Her knuckles whitened around her pen, the only thing in her body that betrayed the pressure building like a compressed spring. But her voice stayed level. Level as a laser. The kind of voice that came from a woman who'd had to stay calm while rounds were being fired. Impressive memorization, Dr. Gabriel said, and there was acid in his tone now, frustration bleeding through the smile. Too bad nursing isn't about playing doctor. He turned back to his slides. The room exhaled. Colleagues shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that Laura caught peripherally. She'd just been humiliated in front of everyone, except she'd also just proven she knew more than most residents. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke. That was when Laura understood the game. It wasn't about her being wrong. It was about her being a threat. And threats had to be dismantled systematically. The elevator came on Thursday of the following week. Laura had worked a double shift, 16 hours straight in the ICU, which meant her feet ached in that deep bone way and her scrubs had absorbed enough of other people's fluids that she'd need 3 washes to feel human again. She stepped into the elevator at 11:47 p.m., her badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck, her cardigan wrapped around shoulders that had begun to curve inward from exhaustion. Dr. Gabriel was already inside. She didn't see him until the doors were closing. He stood in the back corner, and he didn't move when she entered. She registered his presence with the same assessment mechanism that kept soldiers alive: location, exit points, threat level. She pressed the button for the lobby and turned to face the doors. He moved like a man with nothing to prove and everything to say. 3 steps forward until he was standing beside her. Then he reached out and blocked the sensors. The doors hissed and slid backward. "People like you," he said quietly, and his voice had the texture of something dangerous pretending to be civil. "Thinking combat experience makes you qualified for critical care. You don't belong here. You're a liability waiting to happen." He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp, like he'd ordered confidence from a department store. Close enough that his breath moved across the side of her face. Close enough that this was no longer a professional conversation. This was a man pressing his weight into a space until someone broke. Laura turned her head. Her eyes met his. Flat. Empty. The kind of eyes that had looked across a rifle sight and made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She didn't speak. 15 seconds passed. Then 20. Dr. Gabriel's jaw tightened. She saw him recalculate, saw the moment when he realized that intimidation required an opponent willing to be intimidated. He was holding his breath, his face flushed, his hand still against the door sensor. He stepped back. The doors hissed open. The lobby air rushed in, cooler, neutral, carrying the faint smell of industrial cleaner and late-night hospital silence. Laura stepped out without looking at him. Without changing her pace. Without any acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. She walked toward the exit with the same measured stride that had carried her through Kandahar province, and only when the automatic doors closed behind her and the night air hit her face did her heart begin hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. Her hand trembled as she walked to her car. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. Pure restraint. The kind of restraint that came from knowing exactly how much damage she could do with her hands, and choosing not to. The locker was a catalogue of cruelty. Friday morning. Laura arrived at 6:47 a.m. for the early shift, badge in hand, ready for the mechanical routine of gearing up for another day of being invisible. She opened her locker on the 3rd row of the nurse's station changing room, and the air in her chest stopped moving. Wannabe Doc was spray-painted across the interior in letters 3 inches tall, the paint a screaming red that looked almost like blood in the fluorescent light. Her spare scrubs hung below it, tagged with the same phrase. And on the bottom shelf, beside her personal items, sat her Bagram combat boots, the worn leather pair she'd owned for 22 years, the boots she'd been wearing the day she'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from the rubble of a marketplace explosion in Kandahar, the boots that held the dust of a country she'd sworn an oath to protect. Those boots now had Wannabe Doc spray-painted across the leather in the same vicious red. Laura stood motionless. 90 seconds passed. Her jaw clenched so tight she could feel her teeth aching. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed controlled, the kind of control that came from training: breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, the meditation that kept soldiers from doing things they'd regret. Then she moved. Methodically. Precisely. She reached in and removed her belongings one item at a time, placing each thing into her bag with the same care she would have used folding a flag. The spray paint had a chemical smell, acrid and fresh, the work of someone who'd done this recently, possibly that morning, possibly late the night before. The paint was still slightly tacky in places, which meant it had been done less than 12 hours ago. She didn't look around the changing room. Didn't check for witnesses. Didn't speak to any of the other nurses who had stopped moving when they saw what was happening, who were now pretending to be very interested in their phone screens and locker combinations. She left her boots there. Couldn't carry them without announcing what had happened. Couldn't walk around Sacred Heart with spray-painted shoes without broadcasting the humiliation. Down the hallway, 30 feet away, Dr. Gabriel stood with his back against the wall, watching. His face carried the expression of a man who'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. A slight smile. The look of someone who'd found the weak point and pressed until something cracked. Laura closed her locker and walked past him toward the ICU, her face a mask, her hand steady, her composure a weapon he couldn't begin to understand. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:23 p.m., when chaos erupted through the security doors and a 300-pound man started screaming for his brother, and Laura realized that the next choice she made would determine whether any of this meant anything at all. The doors burst open at 1,423 hours. 300 pounds of muscle and panic and pure Marine Corps rage moved through the ICU like a collision, and the man's voice, David Torres, though no one yet knew his name, shattered the careful quiet that exists only in places where people are dying. Marcus Chen. Bed 7. Where is my brother? His hands were fists. His face was the color of a tomato left in the sun too long. Two nurses scattered backward like startled birds, their clipboards clattering to the tile floor. A resident froze mid-stride, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. The security guard at the entrance reached for his radio with the desperation of a man calling for backup, knowing backup wouldn't arrive fast enough. Laura was at the medication cart when she heard the roar. She didn't turn immediately. She set down the 4 bags she was holding with the same precision she would have used to secure equipment in a Black Hawk during a dust-off, then moved toward the sound instead of away from it. That was the first difference between her and everyone else in the ICU at that moment. They scattered. She walked toward chaos the way other people walk toward home. David Torres was 23 years old, built like a pickup truck, and his brother was flatlined in a hospital bed with a bleeding hole in his chest. She could read all of that in the way his hands trembled, not from fear, from the desperate restraint of trying not to flip the entire ICU upside down. She knew that tremor. She'd seen it in soldiers who'd just watched their brothers go down. The body knew something the mind was still processing. Hey! Laura's voice dropped. Not quiet, present. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it fills the space like water finding its level. I need you to look at me. Not the room. Not the machines. Me. David's eyes snapped to hers. Wild. Bloodshot. The eyes of a Marine who'd been told his brother was in critical condition and had driven 247 miles in less than 4 hours to find out if that meant his brother was alive or his brother was already gone. Your brother is alive. That's the truth. Laura's hands were visible, palms forward, a gesture from 1,000 de-escalation training sessions, though her training had been classified and involved far more than hospital protocol. He's in trauma right now. The doctors are working. You need to breathe so I can walk you to him. Can you do that? The security guard had stopped at a distance. The resident still hadn't moved. Everyone was waiting to see what the 300-pound man was going to do. Laura was already past waiting. David's breathing was ragged, his jaw working like he was chewing through something invisible. I got a call. I got a call from a chaplain saying my brother was coding. That he might not, his voice cracked like old leather. He's still here. Still fighting. Laura took one step closer, her movements deliberate and slow, nothing sudden. We need to move. Now. Come with me. There was something in her tone, not a question. A command dressed up in reasonable language. David's hands unclenched. The tremor in his shoulders eased fractionally. He followed her down the corridor toward bed 7, the security guard trailing at a careful distance, the resident finally taking a breath. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they found when they reached bed 7. Marcus Chen's eyes were rolling back into his head. His lips had gone the color of old bruises, purple edging into blue. The ventilator was hissing, working overtime, but the oxygen saturation on the monitor was a line moving downward like a stock market crash, a waterfall of red numbers, 89, 84, 78, 71. His chest wall was moving wrong, the improvised chest seal from this morning, the one Laura had fashioned from an MRE package at 03 for 7 hours, had loosened. The suction had failed. The wound was open again, and every breath Marcus took was pulling in more air than blood, which meant his lungs were drowning from the inside while he gasped for oxygen. "No, no, no," David whispered, his entire body collapsing inward like a building imploding. "No, come on, Marcus. Don't do this. Come on." Laura's hands moved before her brain could catch up. This was muscle memory from a decade and a half ago, from field hospitals in Helmand Province where you worked with what you had because waiting for the right equipment meant someone died. Her fingers found Marcus's bedside table, yanked open the drawer. A uniform picture. A wedding ring on a chain. And a duffel bag in the corner of the room, the same duffel she'd noticed yesterday, stuffed with MRE packages, the kind of veteran who never quite left the field. She ripped open a package of beef ravioli with her teeth. The vacuum seal hissed. Her hands were steady, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before under worse circumstances. She tore the plastic flat, positioned it over the reopened sucking wound, that horrible sound of air being pulled in through torn tissue, the sound of a chest trying to breathe where it should only be sealed, and used the medical tape from the bedside tray to seal 3 edges of the plastic, leaving the 4th corner open. 1, 2, 3. Sealed. The oxygen saturation stopped falling. 71, 72. 75. The ventilator's rhythm changed, less panicked, more purposeful. Marcus's eyes stopped rolling. His color began the slow climb back toward something that looked like human. "Jesus Christ," David whispered behind her. How did you? "Crash team is for seconds out." Laura stepped back, her hands finally shaking now that the crisis was past, the adrenaline dump arriving like a delayed punch. She folded her hands in front of her so David couldn't see them moving. "Your brother is stable. He's going to be okay." The crash team arrived in a thunder of footsteps and controlled urgency. 7 people in blue scrubs, a trauma surgeon, 2 residents, the charge nurse. They saw the improvised seal immediately. Laura watched their faces calculate, unauthorized. Unusual. Somehow brilliant. Dr. Gabriel arrived last, his white coat crisp as a surgical sheet, his expression moving through surprise, then something darker, calculation. He stared at the chest seal for exactly 2.3 seconds, then looked at Laura with eyes like a computer processing data that didn't fit any acceptable parameters. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She could read the shift happening in him, the gears turning, the decision being made. He pulled the charge nurse aside in the hallway, his voice low enough that Laura couldn't hear him, high enough that she understood he didn't care if she tried. She could see his hands moving, illustrative, emphatic. The charge nurse's face changed, confusion, then something that looked like concern, or possibly guilt. Over the next 247 minutes, Dr. Gabriel worked with the precision of a man building a case against someone who had saved a life in a way that made him look inadequate. He interviewed each of the 3 nurses who had watched Laura seal the wound, took detailed notes in a leather notebook with a fountain pen, asked specific questions about protocols and authorization and whether they had seen a physician approve the procedure. All 3 of them said no. All 3 of them watched Laura while they answered, apology in their eyes. He reassigned them to different shifts before they could compare stories. He did this through the charge nurse, casual and administrative, nothing that looked like retaliation. Just scheduling optimization. He opened the incident report on the hospital's computer system and added a paragraph in his clinical handwriting, unsupervised interventional procedure. MRE packaging applied to wound without physician authorization or knowledge. Patient outcome positive, but protocol violation represents significant liability exposure and raises questions about clinical judgment under stress. He called the hospital's risk management director from his personal cell phone at 1,647 hours, his voice carrying the weight of professional concern. "I have concerns about dangerous improvisation in our ICU. A nurse performed an unauthorized invasive procedure this afternoon. Patient survived, but we need to discuss liability exposure and whether she has the formal training for field medicine." He restricted Laura's access to patient files by 1843 hours, citing ongoing review of clinical judgment. When she tried to pull up Marcus Chen's chart at 1902 hours to confirm his latest labs, she found herself locked out. The message on the screen was administrative. The message underneath was clear. By 2140 hours, Dr. Gabriel had built his case with the precision of a sniper preparing a shot. The termination letter was already printed, sitting on his desk, signed by the hospital's director of nursing, a woman who had never met Laura, who was simply following the recommendation of a tenured physician with no reason to disbelieve him. "Please, sit down." Dr. Gabriel's office was the kind of sterile that feels like a warning. His diploma on the wall was from Johns Hopkins. His bookshelf held medical textbooks arranged by height, not subject matter. He gestured to a chair that faced his desk with his back to the door, a position designed to maximize the sense of exposure. Laura Saturday. Her hands were folded. Her expression was neutral, the face of a woman who had already accepted the worst and was simply waiting for it to be confirmed. "I have to let you go." Dr. Gabriel slid the termination letter across his desk, his fingers not releasing it until she reached for it. Gross violation of medical protocol. Dangerous improvisation. Lack of formal emergency training. The hospital's risk management team agrees this is a liability we cannot accept. Laura read the letter once. Her eyes didn't move faster or slower than they should have. When she finished, she folded it in half and set it on her lap. "I understand," she said quietly. "Do you?" Dr. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, and his satisfaction was so obvious it hung in the air like smoke. "Because what you did this morning, whatever you think you were doing, whatever you think justified breaking protocol, that's exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that gets patients killed. You're not a doctor. You don't have a license for invasive procedures. You can't just make decisions because you think you know better." Laura stood. Her chair made no sound as she pushed it back. She'd learned decades ago how to move without announcing herself. She set the termination letter on his desk. She looked at him for exactly long enough that he understood she had heard him, that she had processed him, and that she would remember him. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, and every word was smooth as a knife blade. She walked out of Sacred Heart Medical Center at 2,201 hours carrying a cardboard box containing her stethoscope, her personal coffee mug, and a folded pair of worn combat boots, the same boots she'd been wearing in Kabul 20 years ago when a marketplace explosion turned an ordinary afternoon into a medical emergency, when an 8-year-old boy's intestines were visible through a hole in his stomach, when she'd carried him to a field hospital and held him together long enough for someone else to close the wound. She didn't know that boy's name at the time. She knew it now. David Torres. 300 pounds of Marine. Still carrying that scar, still carrying the memory, still carrying the gratitude that transcends normal human emotion because you don't forget the person who saved your life when you were small enough to fit in their arms. The parking lot was dark. Rain was starting, that Jacksonville rain that feels personal, that hammers the asphalt like applause that nobody asked for. Laura stood in it for exactly 47 seconds, then walked to her truck and drove to the hospital laundry facility, where she let herself in with a key she should have returned that evening. The fluorescent lights were humming their tired 60 Hz song. The washing machines were empty, patient, waiting. Laura carried her folded scrubs to the industrial folding table and began the ritual she'd performed 1,000 times before, the same precision she'd once used to fold a flag, hospital corners, exact thirds, each crease sharp enough to cut skin. She was still folding when the sun came up. She didn't stop. The MRE package was already in her hands. Cotton tan exterior, stamped with a date from 2019. Marcus Chen had been holding it like a talisman, a piece of home tucked into his hospital gown alongside the monitors and 4 lines. The sucking chest wound had reopened when the defibrillator paddles hit his ribs the second time, air whistling through the hole in his chest like a tea kettle screaming. Dr. Gabriel stood frozen at the monitor bank, his mouth open but issuing no orders. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, competing with the sound of a man drowning from the inside. Laura didn't wait. She tore open the MRE package with her teeth, muscle memory overriding protocol. The plastic ripped. Her hands moved like they'd moved 10,000 times before, not in a hospital, but in places where waiting meant watching someone die on a medevac chopper. She found the plastic backing, positioned it over the wound, and sealed 3 sides with tape from the crash cart. The 4th side stayed loose, a one-way valve. Air could escape. Blood could drain. Life could continue. 10 seconds. Her fingers had been steady. Not because she was calm. Because her nervous system had been trained by the 160th SAW, by combat surgery in field hospitals, by 20 years of keeping people alive when the margin between breathing and not breathing measured itself in millimeters. O2 sat climbed. 68, 72. 78, the monitors beeping steadied from panic to purposeful. By the time the crash cart arrived, the blood pressure was climbing. Marcus Chen was gasping but alive, his wound sealed with military-grade field medicine and determination. Dr. Gabriel watched the entire intervention from 6 feet away, his face a mask of calculation. The moment Laura's hands left the patient's chest, his expression shifted. Not to gratitude. To opportunity. By that evening, he'd already begun. The nursing staff who'd witnessed the procedure, Jennifer from the night shift, Roy who'd been running the monitors, the respiratory therapist named Patel, they all received shift reassignments within 4 hours. Different units. Different schedules. No chance to corroborate a story. It was done with such surgical precision that none of them realized it was happening until they checked the posted schedule at change of shift and found their names missing from the ICU rotation. Dr. Gabriel had simply called the staffing coordinator and mentioned that these 3 had expressed interest in cross-training in other departments. Nobody questioned a physician trying to develop staff. The incident report was the next move. Laura had submitted hers at 11 p.m., 3 pages detailing the emergency, the improvised intervention, the outcome. Dr. Gabriel pulled it from the digital queue at 2 a.m. when the night shift was skeleton crew and no one was watching the administrative servers. He didn't delete it. Deletion was obvious. Instead, he edited with the care of a surgeon removing a tumor without damaging surrounding tissue. He reframed the timeline. He changed initiated emergency airway management to attempted and sanctioned procedure. He added a line about deviation from established critical care protocols and a sentence, his own invention, claiming that Laura had delayed calling for physician authorization by nearly 3 minutes. The minute she'd actually spent stabilizing a bleeding man. The risk management director, Richard Koreff, received a call from Dr. Gabriel at 8 a.m. the next morning. The voice on the other end was reasonable. Concerned. The voice of a colleague protecting patient safety. Richard, I need to discuss an incident from last night that has me troubled. One of our nurses, Bennett, from ICU, performed what I can only describe as an improvisational medical intervention without consulting me or obtaining proper authorization. I'm worried about her judgment, frankly. And the liability exposure. He didn't mention that he'd authorized it retroactively in his own notes. He didn't mention that the patient had lived. He mentioned patient safety and liability 3 times in 90 seconds. Koreff took notes. Koreff always took notes. Within 24 hours, Laura's access to patient files had been restricted. She couldn't pull up chart histories. Couldn't document her assessments. Couldn't do her job without filing a request to the supervising physician, a request that would land on Dr. Gabriel's desk, where he could deny it with professional courtesy. I'm concerned about her independent decision-making, he'd tell Koreff. Each restriction added another brick to the wall. The office was on the 3rd floor, windows overlooking the parking lot where the sun was setting into Jacksonville's humid July sky. Laura stood in front of his desk because he didn't invite her to sit. The power dynamic was the point. She was standing. He was seated. He slid a letter across the mahogany surface with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate him. His voice was calm, almost regretful. The voice of a man making a difficult but necessary decision. Your actions yesterday constituted a gross violation of medical protocol, Ms. Bennett. You performed an invasive emergency procedure without physician authorization, without formal emergency medical certification. The risk to this patient and others is unacceptable. Laura picked up the letter. The paper was cream-colored, heavy stock. Her termination was printed in 10-point Arial, black ink on expensive fibers. Effective immediately. She read it the way she'd once read mission briefings in a desert compound, absorbing every detail, no expression crossing her face. Her heart rate remained steady. Her hands didn't shake. Dr. Gabriel continued. Your combat cowboy instincts may have worked once. But what about the next time? What about when someone dies because you decided to improvise instead of waiting for proper medical direction? The implication hung in the recycled air between them. That the patient's survival was luck. That she was reckless. That she didn't belong. Laura could have fought. She could have mentioned the 43 lives she'd sustained under fire. Could have pulled out her discharge papers and described the operations that made this kind of intervention not just training but muscle memory at the cellular level. Could have said that she'd been commissioned to make exactly these kinds of decisions for 20 years. But she'd chosen this. Honorable discharge after 2 decades, trading fatigues for scrubs, genuinely wanting the quiet satisfaction of healing without classified missions that would need to be redacted from personnel files. She'd never hidden her service, the Marine's pin on her lanyard was visible every shift. But she'd never advertised the operations that made her hands know exactly how to seal a chest wound in under 10 seconds. I understand. Her voice was level. A nurse speaking to a physician. Deferential. Professional. She signed the acknowledgement form and set the pen on his desk, the click of metal on wood the only sound in the room. Then she stood, turned, and walked out of his office. Through the hallway. Down the stairwell. Out of Sacred Heart for what she believed was the last time. The laundry room at 5:30 a.m. smelled like industrial detergent and the ghost of 1,000 hospital shifts. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed with a kind of persistent electricity that never actually slept. Laura returned her scrubs, 3 sets folded with precision that bordered on ritual. She'd folded flags the same way. The same crease. The same attention to corners. Each scrub top became a rectangle, then a square, then something that could fit in your palm if you compressed it hard enough. The pants came next. The jacket last. 3 items representing 18 months of training, 43 patients saved, 127 shifts, and a career that had ended in an office with a mahogany desk and a man who'd never fired a weapon or held someone bleeding while waiting for a medevac. The institutional detergent smell, sharp, chemical, almost aggressive, mixed in her mouth with the metallic taste of something she recognized as defeat. Not the defeat of a battle lost. That tasted different. That had an edge to it, something that sharpened you. This tasted like surrender. Like choosing civilian life and then discovering that civilian life didn't want you. That the thing you'd become to survive the wars was the exact thing that made you unemployable in peace. She set the last folded scrub on the counter beside the others and walked out. Her car was still in the parking lot, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that smelled like coffee grounds and the ghost of 1,000 miles. The sunrise was breaking over Jacksonville like an accusation, orange and gold spreading across the windshield. On the passenger seat sat her worn combat boots from Bagram, still tagged with wannabe doc in red spray paint, the insult now a permanent marker of who she actually was. Just a nurse. Not qualified. Not trusted. Not enough. For the first time in 20 years, through 2 tours in Helmand Province, through an IED that took her hearing in one ear for 6 months, through the marketplace in Kabul where a bleeding child had needed her hands to survive, Laura Bennett sat in her car as the sun came up and let herself cry. Not loud. Not the kind of crying that announces itself. Just the kind that happens when you've been composed for so long that composure becomes the only thing holding you together, and then someone takes away the one place where composure was enough. She didn't know that David Torres was already awake. Didn't know that her patient, the one she'd saved with an MRE package and muscle memory, had called his brother the chaplain. Didn't know that the chaplain had called the hospital administration demanding answers about why the nurse who'd saved his life had been terminated. Didn't know that a board meeting was being scheduled. Didn't know that Admiral Richardson was flying into Jacksonville that afternoon for a donor event and would stay for something far more important. All Laura knew at 6:17 a.m. on a July morning was that the failure tasted like detergent and sounded like fluorescent lights humming their indifferent mechanical song, and that she'd spent 20 years becoming the one thing she wasn't supposed to be: a name. A rank. A legend in classified operations. And it had taken one man with a mahogany desk and petty ambition to remind her that legends don't belong in hospitals. The sun kept rising. Her phone remained silent. She didn't know that it was about to ring. Dr. Gabriel discovered the truth while building his termination case, accessing Laura's military file through a contact at the Veterans Affairs Office, a contact who owed him favors from a malpractice settlement 3 years prior. The file arrived in his inbox with heavy redaction bars across entire pages, classified operation summaries reduced to black ink and timestamp stamps marked Operational Security Restriction. But one name survived the censors: Gunnery Sergeant Laura Bennett. Attached to operations in background that remained classified even in summary form. His hands trembled as he read, not from shock, but from the cold realization that he'd spent 2 weeks methodically destroying someone whose background he'd never investigated, whose competence he'd mistaken for arrogance, whose calm under pressure was muscle memory from places he'd never been. He didn't know that accessing a protected intelligence assets personnel file triggered an automatic FBI monitoring flag. He didn't know that the hospital's IT security system logged every keystroke, every database query, every unauthorized access with an audit trail that couldn't be altered or deleted. He didn't know that Diane Foster, the hospital's liaison officer who'd mentioned CIA operational security protocols during the board meeting, had already contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 0900 hours that morning. The emergency hospital board meeting convened at 1400 hours on a Tuesday. Dr. Gabriel had demanded it, insisted on his right to justify the firing, positioned himself as a whistleblower protecting the institution from a reckless nurse who'd violated every protocol in the medical textbook. The CMO sat at the head of the conference table. The hospital's legal counsel took notes. The board members shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the accusation, suspicious of the termination's timing immediately after a life-saving intervention. Then David Torres asked to speak. He stood from the back of the room, still in uniform, a Marine Corps dress blues with a chaplain's insignia and the kind of bearing that made conversation stop mid-sentence. His voice was steady, modulated, the voice of someone trained to comfort the dying and speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "I was 8 years old in Kabul," David said. "Marketplace explosion. My leg was shattered. My brother Marcus was bleeding out beside me." He paused. The room was utterly silent. A gunnery sergeant pulled me from the rubble. She applied a tourniquet while rounds impacted the wall behind us. She held pressure on my brother's chest wound while calling for extraction. I didn't know her name then. But I knew she saved my life. Dr. Gabriel's face went pale. "That gunnery sergeant is Laura Bennett," David continued. "I found out 2 days ago when my brother regained consciousness in her ICU. When he told me how she saved his life again, this time with an MRE package and hands that moved like she'd done it 1,000 times before." The CMO leaned forward. "Mr. Torres." "Chaplain Torres," he corrected quietly. "Chaplain David Torres, United States Marine Corps." He opened a folder. "I brought the unit's unofficial history. The one we keep because the official records are still classified. Here's Gunnery Sergeant Bennett holding a perimeter for 6 hours with a compromised patrol. Hostile force of 37. She was the only thing between those Marines and a full Taliban assault. She held that line until Black Hawk helicopters arrived." The papers circulated around the table. Hands trembled as board members read. A man in a Navy uniform stood from the corner, an admiral visiting Sacred Heart for a donor event, someone whose presence no one had anticipated. His medals caught the fluorescent light like warnings. His voice cut through the room like a command. "I know Gunnery Sergeant Bennett's record," he said. "Not the redacted version. The real one. He paused, letting the weight settle. Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded for extraordinary heroism during a combat operation where she provided life-saving medical intervention under sustained fire. He waited. The room held its breath. 2 Purple Hearts. One from shrapnel during that same operation. One from a blast concussion that should have killed her. Another pause. Another wait. Defense Superior Service Medal for direct action operations that remain classified. Dr. Gabriel's face drained of all color. His hands clenched into fists on the conference table. Diane Foster, the hospital's liaison officer, stood slowly. Her movement commanded attention. "I should clarify my role," she said. Her voice carried the particular resonance of someone accustomed to rooms where people listened or disappeared. "I work for the Central Intelligence Agency." Gunnery Sergeant Bennett's operational code name still carry security clearance restrictions. Those medals the Admiral mentioned, she earned them doing work that still can't be declassified. Work that matters. The room erupted. Board members spoke simultaneously, voices overlapping in shock and realization. Dr. Gabriel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile with a sound like fingernails on glass. His jaw worked silently. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time, unraveling like a sweater pulled from the wrong thread. He made his fatal mistake in desperation. That evening, at 0237 hours, Dr. Gabriel sat at his home computer and attempted to access Sacred Heart's personnel database using credentials he'd obtained 3 years prior, credentials that should have been deactivated but hadn't been. His hands shook as he typed. He knew what he needed to do: create evidence. Falsify disciplinary records. Backdate written warnings. Forge signatures from the nurse manager. Fabricate patient complaints. Doctor timestamps on email chains. Build a false history of violations that would retroactively justify the termination. He didn't know that every keystroke was being logged. He didn't know that the IT director was monitoring the access in real time, recording the alterations, preserving the evidence. He didn't know that 2 FBI agents were already driving toward Sacred Heart, federal warrants in their briefcases, orders to arrest him on charges of falsifying documents related to a protected intelligence asset. Wednesday morning. 0803 hours. Dr. Gabriel walked through Sacred Heart's lobby with a cup of coffee, still believing he had time, still believing the narrative could be controlled. 2 agents in dark suits intercepted him near the elevator bank. One was tall and gray-tempered. The other had the particular patience of someone who'd done this before. "Dr. Gabriel," the taller agent said, "we need to talk about falsifying federal documents related to a protected intelligence asset." His coffee cup fell. It shattered on the tile floor, ceramic fragments scattering like broken promises. The liquid spread across the floor in a dark stain that looked like blood. They handcuffed him in front of the nurses' station, the same station where he'd once held absolute authority, where nurses had whispered his criticisms and feared his judgment. Staff froze as the agents guided him toward the exit. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The charges came swift and precise: falsifying records of a former intelligence operative, unauthorized access to classified personnel files, obstruction of a federal investigation, and crimes against federal statutes that carried penalties measured in years, not months. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. Within 2 weeks, it was revoked permanently. 2 years later, Laura Bennett ran Sacred Heart's emergency medicine training program. Her office overlooked the ICU where everything changed, where a 300-pound Marine had stormed through doors in panic, where she'd calmed him with her voice, where she'd saved a life with her hands. On her desk, those worn combat boots from Bagram sat openly now, no longer hidden in a locker, no longer tagged with cruel spray paint. They held down a framed letter from Chaplain David Torres and his brother Marcus, both alive, both grateful, both understanding what Laura had done long before anyone else knew who she really was. She taught a class of new nurses emergency trauma protocols, her voice dropping into commands, her posture erect, her hands steady as surgical lasers. The same nurses who'd once whispered about her now hung on every word. She demonstrated improvised chest seal techniques with a clarity that came from having done it for real, under fire, with lives hanging on the precision of her fingers. The CMO consulted her on protocol updates. Board members sought her counsel. Administrators asked her opinion on policy changes. She was still a nurse, still chosen this life, still wanted it, but now she brought her full self to the work, and no one questioned her authority because authority had nothing to do with the credentials on her wall. A strip mall in Jacksonville suburbs. Dr. Gabriel sat at a folding table outside an insurance office, his polo shirt branded with a corporate logo, his medical past erased from conversation and credential. He handed flyers to pedestrians who ignored him. His fall was complete: 18 months in minimum security federal prison, permanent prohibition from medical practice, employment prospects limited to commission sales, and the slow humiliation of recognition he'd once demanded. He was not dead. Death would have been mercy. Instead, he was diminished. Forgotten. Replaced. The name that once commanded respect was now a cautionary tale in ethics seminars. Laura met Marcus and David for coffee on a Thursday afternoon. They'd become brothers, bound by an old battlefield in Kabul and a new one in Jacksonville. David asked what she'd learned from everything. Laura looked out the window where her office was visible, where those combat boots held down the commendation letter, where her hands had saved lives twice, once in a war that still couldn't be named, once in a hospital that finally knew who she was. Power is not a title, she said. Power is the ability to help. She walked back into Sacred Heart's ICU as the afternoon shift began. Nurses greeted her by name. Patients recognized her voice. Her scrubs were crisp and her hands steady, finally home after 20 years of carrying a secret that wasn't hers to keep anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar song. The heart monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The work continued, the saving, the healing, the quiet heroism of hands that had learned their trade in places most people would never understand. This is Laura Bennett's story. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Share your story in the comments below. And if you've ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us, the ones in scrubs, the ones with secrets, the ones who choose to help.